Jacqueline Lee Kennedy-Onassis, born on July 28, 1929, died on May 19, 1994, was an American socialite, writer, photographer, and book editor who served as First Lady of the United States from 1961 to 1963, as the wife of President John F. Kennedy. A popular First Lady, she endeared the American public with her devotion to her family, dedication to the historic preservation of the White House, the campaign she led to preserve and restore historic landmarks and architecture, along with her interest in American history, culture and arts. During her lifetime, she was regarded as an international icon for her unique fashion choices. After graduating with a Bachelor of Arts in French Literature from George Washington University in 1951, Bouvier started working for the Washington Times-Herald as an inquiring photographer. The following year, she met then Congressman John Kennedy at a dinner party in Washington. He was elected to the Senate that same year, and the couple married on September 12, 1953, in Newport, Rhode Island. They had 4 children, 2 of whom died in infancy. Following her husband's election to the presidency in 1960, Kennedy was known for her highly publicized restoration of the White House and emphasis on arts and culture, as well as for her style. She also traveled to many countries where her fluency in foreign languages and history made her very popular. At age 31, she was the 3rd youngest First Lady of the United States when her husband was inaugurated. After the assassination and funeral of her husband in 1963, Kennedy and her children largely withdrew from public view. In 1968, she married Greek shipping magnate Aristotle Onassis, which caused controversy. Following Onassis's death in 1975, she had a career as a book editor in New York City, first at Viking Press and then at Doubleday, and worked to restore her public image. Even after her death, she ranks as one of the most popular and recognizable First Ladies in American history, and in 1999, she was listed as one of Gallup's most admired men and women of the 20th century. She died in 1994 and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery alongside President Kennedy. Surveys of historians conducted periodically by the Siena College Research Institute since 1982 have consistently found Kennedy-Onassis to rank among the most highly regarded First Ladies by the assessments of historians. Jacqueline Lee Bouvier was born on July 28, 1929, at Southampton Hospital in Southampton, New York, to Wall Street stockbroker John Vernew Blackjack Bouvier III and socialite Janet Norton Lee. Her mother was of Irish descent, 8, and her father had French, Scottish, and English ancestry. Named after her father, she was baptized at the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola in Manhattan and raised in the Roman Catholic faith. Her sister, Caroline Lee, was born 4 years later on March 3, 1933. In the fall of 1947, Jacqueline Bouvier entered Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, at that time a women's institution. She had wanted to attend Sarah Lawrence College, closer to New York City, but her parents insisted that she choose the more isolated Vassar. She was an accomplished student who participated in the school's art and drama clubs and wrote for its newspaper. Due to her dislike of Vassar's location in Poughkeepsie, she did not take an active part in its social life and instead traveled back to Manhattan for the weekends. She had made her debut to high society in the summer before entering college and became a frequent presence in New York social functions. Hearst columnist Igor Cassini dubbed her the debutante of the year. She spent her junior year, 1949 to 1950, in France, at the University of Grenoble in Grenoble, and at the Sorbonne in Paris, in a study abroad program through Smith College. Upon returning home, she transferred to George Washington University in Washington, D.C., graduating with a Bachelor of Arts degree in French literature in 1951. During the early years of her marriage to John F. Kennedy, she took continuing education classes in American history at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. While attending George Washington, Jacqueline Bouvier won a 12-month junior editorship at Vogue magazine. She had been selected over several hundred other women nationwide. The position entailed working for 6 months in the magazine's New York City office and spending the remaining 6 months in Paris. Before beginning the job, she celebrated her college graduation and her sister Lee's high school graduation by traveling with her to Europe for the summer. The trip was the subject of her only autobiography, One Special Summer, co-authored with Lee. It is also the only one of her published works to feature Jacqueline Bouvier's drawings. On her first day at Vogue, the managing editor advised her to quit and go back to Washington. According to biographer Barbara Leeming, the editor was concerned about Bouvier's marriage prospects. She was 22 years of age and was considered too old to be single in her social circles. She followed the advice, left the job and returned to Washington after only 1 day of work. Bouvier moved back to Marywood and was referred by a family friend to the Washington Times-Herald, where editor Frank Waldrop hired her as a part-time receptionist. A week later she requested more challenging work, and Waldrop sent her to city editor Sidney Epstein, who hired her as an inquiring camera girl despite her inexperience, paying her $25 a week. He recalled, "I remember her as this very attractive, cute as hell girl, and all the guys in the newsroom giving her a good look." The position required her to pose witty questions to individuals chosen at random on the street and take their pictures for publication in the newspaper alongside selected quotations from their responses. In addition to the random man on the street vignettes, she sometimes sought interviews with people of interest, such as 6-year-old Tricia Nixon. Bouvier interviewed Tricia a few days after her father Richard Nixon was elected to the vice presidency in the 1952 election. During this time, Bouvier was briefly engaged to a young stockbroker named John Husted. After only a month of dating, the couple published the announcement in the New York Times in January 1952. After 3 months, she called off the engagement because she had found him immature and boring once she got to know him better. Marriage to John F. Kennedy. Jacqueline Bouvier and U.S. Representative John F. Kennedy belonged to the same social circle and were formally introduced by a mutual friend, journalist Charles L. Bartlett, at a dinner party in May 1952. She was attracted to Kennedy's physical appearance, wit and wealth. The pair also shared the similarities of Catholicism, writing, enjoying reading and having previously lived abroad. Kennedy was busy running for the U.S. Senate seat in Massachusetts. The relationship grew more serious and he proposed to her after the November election. Bouvier took some time to accept, because she had been assigned to cover the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in London for the Washington Times-Herald. After a month in Europe, she returned to the United States and accepted Kennedy's marriage proposal. She then resigned from her position at the newspaper. Their engagement was officially announced on June 25, 1953. She was 24 and he was 36. Bouvier and Kennedy married on September 12, 1953, at St. Mary's Church in Newport, Rhode Island, in a mass celebrated by Boston's Archbishop Richard Cushing. The wedding was considered the social event of the season with an estimated 700 guests at the ceremony and 1,200 at the reception that followed at Hammersmith Farm. The wedding dress was designed by Anne Lowe of New York City, and is now housed in the Kennedy Library in Boston, Massachusetts. The dresses of her attendants were also created by Lowe, who was not credited by Jacqueline Kennedy. The newlyweds honeymooned in Acapulco, Mexico, before settling in their new home, Hickory Hill in McLean, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C. Kennedy developed a warm relationship with her parents-in-law, Joseph and Rose Kennedy. In the early years of their marriage, the couple faced several personal setbacks. John Kennedy suffered from Addison's disease and from chronic and at times debilitating back pain, which had been exacerbated by a war injury. In late 1954, he underwent a near-fatal spinal operation. Additionally, Jacqueline Kennedy suffered a miscarriage in 1955 and in August 1956 gave birth to a stillborn daughter, Arabella. They subsequently sold their Hickory Hill estate to Kennedy's brother Robert, who occupied it with his wife Ethel and their growing family, and bought a townhouse on N Street in Georgetown. The Kennedys also resided at an apartment at 122 Bowdoin Street in Boston, their permanent Massachusetts residence during John's congressional career. Kennedy gave birth to daughter Caroline on November 27, 1957. At the time, she and her husband were campaigning for his re-election to the Senate, and they posed with their infant daughter for the cover of the April 21, 1958, issue of Life magazine. They traveled together during the campaign as part of their efforts to reduce the physical separation that had characterized the first 5 years of their marriage. Soon enough, John Kennedy started to notice the value that his wife added to his congressional campaign. Kenneth O'Donnell remembered that the size of the crowd was twice as big when she accompanied her husband. He also recalled her as always cheerful and obliging. John's mother Rose, however, observed that Jacqueline was not a natural-born campaigner due to her shyness and was uncomfortable with too much attention. In November 1958, John was re-elected to a second term. He credited Jacqueline's visibility in the ads and stumping as vital assets in securing his victory, and he called her simply invaluable. In July 1959, the historian Arthur M. Schlesinger visited the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport and had his first conversation with Jacqueline Kennedy. He found her to have tremendous awareness, an all-seeing eye and a ruthless judgment. That year, John Kennedy traveled to 14 states, but Jacqueline took long breaks from the trips to spend time with their daughter, Caroline. She also counseled her husband on improving his wardrobe in preparation for the presidential campaign planned for the following year. In particular, she traveled to Louisiana to visit Edmund Reggie and to help her husband garner support in the state for his presidential bid. First Lady of the United States. On January 3, 1960, John F. Kennedy was a United States Senator from Massachusetts when he announced his candidacy for the presidency and launched his campaign nationwide. In the early months of the election year, Jacqueline Kennedy accompanied her husband to campaign events such as whistle stops and dinners. Shortly after the campaign began, she became pregnant. Due to her previous high-risk pregnancies, she decided to stay at home in Georgetown. Jacqueline Kennedy subsequently participated in the campaign by writing a weekly syndicated newspaper column, Campaign Wife, answering correspondence, and giving interviews to the media. Despite her non-participation in the campaign, Kennedy became the subject of intense media attention with her fashion choices. On one hand, she was admired for her personal style. She was frequently featured in women's magazines alongside film stars and named as one of the 12 best-dressed women in the world. On the other hand, her preference for French designers and her spending on her wardrobe brought her negative press. In order to downplay her wealthy background, Kennedy stressed the amount of work she was doing for the campaign and declined to publicly discuss her clothing choices. On July 13 at the 1960 Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles, the party nominated John F. Kennedy for president. Jacqueline Kennedy did not attend the nomination due to her pregnancy, which had been publicly announced 10 days earlier. She was in Hyannisport when she watched the September 26, 1960 debate, which was the nation's first televised presidential debate, between her husband and Republican candidate Richard Nixon, who was the incumbent vice president. Marion Cannon, the wife of Arthur Schlesinger, watched the debate with her. Days after the debates, Jacqueline Kennedy contacted Schlesinger and informed him that John wanted his aid along with that of John Kenneth Galbraith in preparing for the third debate on October 13. She wished for them to give her husband new ideas and speeches. On September 29, 1960, the Kennedys appeared together for a joint interview on Person to Person, interviewed by Charles Collingwood. On November 8, 1960, John F. Kennedy narrowly defeated Republican opponent Richard Nixon in the U.S. presidential election. A little over 2 weeks later, on November 25, Jacqueline Kennedy gave birth to the couple's first son, John F. Kennedy Jr. She spent 2 weeks recuperating in the hospital, during which the most minute details of both her and her son's conditions were reported by the media in what has been considered the first instance of national interest in the Kennedy family. Kennedy's husband was sworn in as president on January 20, 1961. She insisted they also kept a family home away from the public eye and rented Glen Ora at Middleburg. As a presidential couple, the Kennedys differed from the Eisenhowers by their political affiliation, youth, and their relationship with the media. Historian Gil Troy has noted that in particular, they emphasized vague appearances rather than specific accomplishments or passionate commitments and therefore fit in well in the early 1960s cool, TV-oriented culture. The discussion about Kennedy's fashion choices continued during her years in the White House, and she became a trendsetter, hiring American designer Oleg Cassini to design her wardrobe. She was the first presidential wife to hire a press secretary, Pamela Turner, and carefully managed her contact with the media, usually shying away from making public statements, and strictly controlling the extent to which her children were photographed. The media portrayed Kennedy as the ideal woman, which led academic Maureen Beasley to observe that she created an unrealistic media expectation for first ladies that would challenge her successors. Nevertheless, she attracted worldwide positive public attention and gained allies for the White House and international support for the Kennedy administration and its Cold War policies. Although Kennedy stated that her priority as a First Lady was to take care of the President and their children, she also dedicated her time to the promotion of American arts and preservation of its history. The restoration of the White House was her main contribution, but she also furthered the cause by hosting social events that brought together elite figures from politics and the arts. One of her unrealized goals was to found a Department of the Arts, but she did contribute to the establishment of the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, established during Johnson's tenure. Foreign trips. Throughout her husband's presidency and more than any of the preceding First Ladies, Kennedy made many official visits to other countries, on her own or with the President. Despite the initial worry that she might not have political appeal, she proved popular among international dignitaries. Before the Kennedys' first official visit to France in 1961, a television special was shot in French with the First Lady on the White House lawn. After arriving in the country, she impressed the public with her ability to speak French, as well as her extensive knowledge of French history. At the conclusion of the visit, Time magazine seemed delighted with the First Lady and noted, "There was also that fellow who came with her." Even President Kennedy joked, "I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I have enjoyed it." From France, the Kennedys traveled to Vienna, Austria, where Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was asked to shake the president's hand for a photo. He replied, "I'd like to shake her hand first." Khrushchev later sent her a puppy. The animal was significant for being the offspring of Strelka, the dog that had gone to space during a Soviet space mission. At the urging of U.S. Ambassador to India John Kenneth Galbraith, Kennedy undertook a tour of India and Pakistan with her sister Lee Radziwill in 1962. The tour was amply documented in photojournalism as well as in Galbraith's journals and memoirs. The President of Pakistan, Ayub Khan, had given her a horse named Sardar as a gift. He had found out on his visit to the White House that he and the First Lady had a common interest in horses. Life magazine correspondent Anne Chamberlain wrote that Kennedy conducted herself magnificently, although noting that her crowds were smaller than those that President Dwight Eisenhower and Queen Elizabeth II attracted when they had previously visited these countries. In addition to these well-publicized trips during the 3 years of the Kennedy administration, she traveled to countries including Afghanistan, Austria, Canada, Colombia, United Kingdom, Greece, Italy, Mexico, Morocco, Turkey, and Venezuela. Unlike her husband, Kennedy was fluent in Spanish, which she used to address Latin American audiences. On November 29, 1963, a week after her husband's assassination, Kennedy was interviewed in Hyannisport by Theodore H. White of Life magazine. In that session, she compared the Kennedy years in the White House to King Arthur's mythical Camelot, commenting that the president often played the title song of Lerner and Loewe's musical recording before retreating to bed. She also quoted Queen Guinevere from the musical, trying to express how the loss felt. The era of the Kennedy administration has subsequently been referred to as the Camelot era, although historians have later argued that the comparison is not appropriate, with Robert Dallek stating that Kennedy's effort to lionize her husband must have provided a therapeutic shield against immobilizing grief. Kennedy and her children remained in the White House for 2 weeks following the assassination. Wanting to do something nice for Jackie, President Johnson offered an ambassadorship to France to her, aware of her heritage and fondness for the country's culture, but she turned the offer down, as well as follow-up offers of ambassadorships to Mexico and the United Kingdom. At her request, Johnson renamed the Florida Space Center the John F. Kennedy Space Center a week after the assassination. Kennedy later publicly praised Johnson for his kindness to her. Kennedy spent 1964 in mourning and made few public appearances. It has been speculated that she may have been suffering from undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder due to intrusive flashbacks. In the winter following the assassination, she and the children stayed at Avril Harriman's home in Georgetown. On January 14, 1964, Kennedy made a televised appearance from the office of the Attorney General, thanking the public for the hundreds of thousands of messages she had received since the assassination, and said she had been sustained by America's affection for her late husband. She purchased a house for herself and her children in Georgetown but sold it later in 1964 and bought a 15th-floor penthouse apartment for $250,000 at 1040 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan in the hopes of having more privacy. In the following years, Kennedy attended selected memorial dedications to her late husband. She also oversaw the establishment of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, which is the repository for official papers of the Kennedy administration. Designed by architect I.M. Pei, it is situated next to the University of Massachusetts campus in Boston. Despite having commissioned William Manchester's authorized account of President Kennedy's death, The Death of a President, Kennedy was subject to significant media attention in 1966 to 1967 when she and Robert Kennedy tried to block the publication. They sued publishers Harper and Row in December 1966. The suit was settled the following year when Manchester removed passages that detailed President Kennedy's private life. White viewed the ordeal as validation of the measures the Kennedy family, Jacqueline in particular, were prepared to take to preserve John's public image. During the Vietnam War in November 1967, Life magazine dubbed Kennedy America's unofficial roving ambassador when she and David Ormsby Gore, former British ambassador to the United States during the Kennedy administration, traveled to Cambodia, where they visited the religious complex of Angkor Wat with Chief of State Norodom Sihanouk. According to historian Milton Osborne, her visit was the start of the repair to Cambodian-U.S. relations, which had been at a very low ebb. She also attended the funeral services of Martin Luther King Jr. in Atlanta, Georgia, in April 1968, despite her initial reluctance due to the crowds and reminders of President Kennedy's death. After her husband's assassination, Jacqueline Kennedy relied heavily on her brother-in-law Robert F. Kennedy. She observed him to be the least like his father of the Kennedy brothers. He had been a source of support after she had suffered a miscarriage early in her marriage. It was he, not her husband, who stayed with her in the hospital. In the aftermath of the assassination, Robert became a surrogate father for her children until eventual demands by his own large family and his responsibilities as Attorney General required him to reduce attention. He credited her with convincing him to stay in politics, and she supported his 1964 run for United States Senator from New York. After Robert Kennedy's death in 1968, Kennedy reportedly suffered a relapse of the depression she had suffered in the days following her husband's assassination nearly 5 years prior. She came to fear for her life and those of her 2 children, saying, "If they're killing Kennedys, then my children are targets. I want to get out of this country." On October 20, 1968, Jacqueline Kennedy married her longtime friend Aristotle Onassis, a Greek shipping magnate who was able to provide the privacy and security she sought for herself and her children. The wedding took place on Scorpios, Onassis's private Greek island in the Ionian Sea. After marrying Onassis, she took the legal name Jacqueline Onassis and consequently lost her right to Secret Service protection, which is an entitlement of a widow of a U.S. president. The marriage brought her considerable adverse publicity. The fact that Aristotle was divorced and his former wife Athena Livanos was still living led to speculation that Jacqueline might be excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church, though that concern was explicitly dismissed by Boston's Archbishop, Cardinal Richard Cushing, as nonsense. She was condemned by some as a public sinner, and became the target of paparazzi who followed her everywhere and nicknamed her Jackie O. After the death of her second husband, Onassis returned permanently to the United States, splitting her time between Manhattan, Martha's Vineyard, and the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, Massachusetts. In 1975, she became a consulting editor at Viking Press, a position that she held for 2 years. Onassis remained the subject of considerable press attention, especially from the paparazzi photographer Ron Galella, who followed her around and photographed her as she went about her normal activities. He took candid photos of her without her permission. She ultimately obtained a restraining order against him, and the situation brought attention to the problem of paparazzi photography. From 1980 until her death, Onassis maintained a close relationship with Maurice Tempelsman, a Belgian-born industrialist and diamond merchant who was her companion and personal financial advisor. In the early 1990s, Onassis supported Bill Clinton and contributed money to his presidential campaign. Following the election, she met with First Lady Hillary Clinton and advised her on raising a child in the White House. In her memoir Living History, Clinton wrote that Onassis was a source of inspiration and advice for me. Democratic consultant and Lewis observed that Onassis had reached out to the Clintons in a way she has not always acted toward leading Democrats in the past. In November 1993, Onassis was thrown from her horse while participating in a fox hunt in Middleburg, Virginia, and was taken to the hospital to be examined. A swollen lymph node was discovered in her groin, which was initially diagnosed by the doctor to be caused by an infection. The fall from the horse contributed to her deteriorating health over the next 6 months. In December, Onassis developed new symptoms, including a stomach ache and swollen lymph nodes in her neck, and was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma, a blood cancer. She began chemotherapy in January 1994 and publicly announced the diagnosis, stating that the initial prognosis was good. She continued to work at Doubleday, but by March the cancer had spread to her spinal cord and brain and to her liver by May and was deemed terminal. Onassis made her last trip home from New York Hospital Cornell Medical Center on May 18, 1994. The following night at 10:15 p.m., she died in her sleep in her Manhattan apartment at age 64, with her children by her side. In the morning, her son, John F. Kennedy Jr., announced his mother's death to the press, stating that she had been surrounded by her friends and her family and her books, and the people and the things that she loved. He added that she did it in her very own way, and on her own terms, and we all feel lucky for that. On May 23, 1994, her funeral mass was held a few blocks away from her apartment at the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola, the Catholic parish where she was baptized in 1929 and confirmed as a teenager, and asked for no cameras to film the event, for privacy. She was interred at Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia, alongside President Kennedy, their son Patrick, and their stillborn daughter Arabella. President Bill Clinton delivered a eulogy at her graveside service. She left an estate that its executors valued at $43.7 million. Thanks for watching HerStory channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe our channel.